The sky over the obsidian citadel was a flat, airless white, the color of a cataract or a dead man's eye. For 400 years, the kingdom of Oakhaven had existed in a state of absolute hush. Legend spoke of a time when the wind whistled through the high pines and the river roared over the jagged rocks of the valley. But those were myths whispered in the dark, dangerous and forbidden. The great silence had fallen during the reign of Cassian the Silent, a king whose heart had supposedly turned to lead after a betrayal so deep it broke the world's music. In reality, Cassian sat upon his throne of muted glass, a prisoner of his own senses. He lived in a world of vibrations, the heavy thud of a guard's boots, the rhythmic pulse of his own blood, the jarring scrape of a chair against the floor. But of sound, there was nothing. No voices, no bird song, no laughter. The world was a pantomime, a flickering shadow play of movement without meaning. It was the Day of Resonance, the annual festival where the High Lords brought their finest tributes to the king in hopes of being the one to finally break the hush. It was a cruel tradition, a 3-day ordeal of sensory deprivation where the wealthiest and most beautiful daughters of the realm paraded their talents before a king who was functionally a statue. They came with instruments of gold and strings made from the hair of celestial beings, each trying to outdo the other in a display of silent virtuosity. Lady Lyra of the Gilded Coast presented a harp carved from the bone of a sea leviathan. She plucked the strings with practiced elegance, her mouth moving in a silent song that the court poets claimed would make angels weep. Cassian watched her, his eyes the color of cold flint, and felt only the dull, annoying thrum of the floorboards beneath his feet. He did not hear the music. He only felt the displacement of air, a hollow draft that smelled of salt and expensive perfume. He raised a hand, a sharp, dismissive gesture, and the lady was led away, her face a mask of silent tears. She was the 47th to fail. Beside the throne stood the high priest Malachor, a man draped in robes of heavy, sound-dampening velvet that seemed to swallow the light around him. Malachor was the architect of the king's court, the one who interpreted Cassian's silent decrees and translated the king's moods into law. He was the filter through which all reality passed. He leaned toward the king now, his lips moving in the exaggerated, slow patterns Cassian used to read intent. And the king's world was a series of lip shapes and vibrations, a puzzle he had spent 4 centuries solving with increasing bitterness. "The people are desperate to please you, my king," Malachor's lips mimicked. "But perhaps the world has simply run out of beauty worthy of your ears. Perhaps the silence is your destiny, a holy peace that the common world is too loud to appreciate." Cassian ignored him. He was tired. The silence was not a peace. It was a weight, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against his eardrums until he wanted to scream just to see if the air would vibrate. He remembered the color of the sky once being blue. But under the curse, the world had faded to shades of iron, ash, and obsidian. Even his own wolf, the primal spirit of his lineage, had gone dormant, curled in a dark corner of his mind like a dying ember. When it no longer snarled, it no longer hunted. It simply waited for the end of the world. The 99th tribute was brought forward as the sun began to dip behind the white horizon. She was a girl from the Mute Slums, the soot-stained district where those who could no longer afford the priest's blessings of quietude were discarded. She was thin, her clothes a patchwork of gray rags, her hands stained with the grease of the clockworks she likely scavenged from the royal trash heaps. She did not carry a harp or a lute or a chest of sapphires. She carried a small, tarnished brass bell, the kind used by shepherds to track stray goats in the foothills. It was cracked down the side, a jagged line that marred its surface. The court erupted in a wave of silent laughter, shoulders shaking, mouths agape in mocking mimes, eyes crinkling with cruel delight. And it was a spectacle of the highest order. A beggar offering a broken toy to a king of iron. Lord Vane, a man whose belly was as large as his ego, gestured toward the door with a sneer. He didn't need to speak. His posture said it all. Trash. Malachor stepped forward, his hand raised to signal the guards. Remove this filth. His lips curled in a snarl of disgust. She mocks the sanctity of this throne. But the girl did not look at the priest. She did not look at the mocking lords. She looked at Cassian. Her eyes were a startling, vibrant amber, the only spark of color in the sea of gray velvet and white sky. They were eyes that had seen the underside of the world and found it wanting. She held the bell aloft. She did not ring it gently. She took a heavy iron nail from her pocket and struck the brass with a sudden, violent force. In a world of absolute hush, the physics of the strike should have produced only a dull vibration, a phantom thrum that disappeared into the dampening fields of the hall. But the crack in the bell was different. It was a flaw that created a frequency the dampening fields couldn't catch. As the iron hit the brass, a sound, a real, piercing, dissonant chim, tore through the hall like a blade through silk. It was not a beautiful sound. It was sharp, ugly, and broken. But to Cassian, it was a thunderclap. The sound hit his ears like a physical blow, a bolt of lightning that traveled through his auditory nerves and exploded in his brain. He gasped, the sound of his own intake of breath echoing in his head like a collapsing mountain. It was the first time he had heard himself breathe in 400 years, the glass throne beneath him, insensitive to the sudden surge of his own long-dormant power, shattered, spider-webbing under the pressure. He fell to his knees, clutching his ears, his eyes wide and wild. The world was screaming. The sound of his heart beating was like a war drum. The rustle of the girl's rags was like a landslide. For the first time in 400 years, the king heard. The hall was in chaos. The nobles were recoiling, sensing the shift in the air even if they could not hear the echo of the chime. They felt the sudden change in temperature, the way the air seemed to thicken with electricity. Malachor's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled purple. He lunged for the girl, his hands outstretched to seize the bell. But Cassian's voice, a rough, tectonic growl that had not been used since the fires of the old world, ripped through the room. Like, stop. The word was a physical force, a shockwave that sent Malachor sprawling across the marble floor. The king stood, his movements no longer mechanical or practiced. He was a predator awakened. He looked at the girl, his chest heaving, his ears ringing with the exquisite agony of sound. Again, he commanded, his voice cracking and raw. Do it again. Lyra did not flinch. She struck the bell once more. The sound was softer this time, a lingering metallic hum that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Cassian's bones. With the sound came a flood of color. The dull white sky outside the window bled into a bruised, sunset purple. The gray tapestries took on a deep, blood-red hue. The world was waking up, and the agony of it was beautiful. Cassian descended the steps of his ruined throne. He did not look at the high lords or the priest. He stopped in front of Lyra. She was so small, her skin smelling of ozone, old metal, and something sweet like wild thyme. He reached out, his hand trembling, actually trembling, and touched the brass bell in her hand. The moment his skin met the metal, the hum traveled from the bell into his fingers, up his arm, and settled in his heart. It was a resonance, a perfect, fated frequency. mate. The word didn't come from his mind. It came from the air itself, whispered by the very atoms of the room. His wolf, the great charcoal-furred beast that had been a ghost in his mind, opened its eyes and roared. The sound was so loud in Cassian's head, he thought his skull might split. But it was a joyous sound, a hungry sound. "What is your name?" he asked. The sound of his own voice was terrifying, a low rumble that felt like home. "Oh, Lyra," she whispered. Her voice was like the first drop of rain after a century of drought. It was the most perfect thing he had ever heard. "You will stay," Cassian said. It was not a king's command, but a drowning man's plea. Malachor scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting toward the shadows. "My king, this is a trick, a resonance spell from the wastes. She is a witch sent to destroy the silence and bring back the chaos of the old wars." Malachor's lips moved frantically, but Cassian could hear the wet, desperate sound of the priest's breathing now. He could hear the lie in the man's throat, a discordant, scratching sound that made his hackles rise. "The silence was the cage, Malachor," Cassian said, his eyes turning a predatory, molten gold. "And you were the one holding the key." He moved Lyra to the high spire, or at the highest point of the citadel where the air was thin and the shadows were long. He did not trust the court, and for good reason. For the next 3 days, Cassian lived in a state of sensory overload. Every sound was a revelation and a threat. The rustle of silk sounded like a forest fire. The clink of silverware was a smithy's hammer. He spent hours just listening to the wind against the stone, weeping at the complexity of the sound. Only Lyra's presence acted as a dampener. When she was near, the chaos of the world's noise organized itself into a melody. He found her in the spire's small garden on the 3rd evening, where she was examining a patch of weeds that had suddenly turned a brilliant emerald green. "The priest has been feeding the silence," she said, her voice a steady anchor in the sea of new sounds. She didn't turn around, whilst she knew the sound of his footsteps now. Heavy, deliberate, and tinged with the metallic click of his greaves. "I found the records in the lower archives while I was scavenging for parts." The silence wasn't a curse of grief, Cassian. It was a spell of suppression. When the world is silent, nobody can hear the screams from the mines. Nobody can hear the gold being diverted to the priest's coffers. Nobody can hear the dissent in the streets. Cassian stood behind her, his shadow falling over the green leaves. He could hear the tiny, rhythmic thrum of her heart. It was a fast, brave sound. He told me the world was quiet because I was broken. He told me the silence was my only protection from the pain of the past. He said the sound of the world would kill me. "He lied," Lyra said, turning to face him. She reached up and touched his chest, or right over his heart. The touch sent a wave of calm through him, a resonance that silenced the roaring in his ears. He didn't want a king. He wanted a monument. Monuments don't ask questions. Monuments don't hear the truth. He used your grief as a battery for his own power. Cassian's hand covered hers, pressing it deeper into his chest. The warmth of her skin was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. He is the anchor, Cassian realized, the truth settling in his mind with the weight of a stone. The spell doesn't live in the air. It lives in him. He feeds it with the blood of the lineage. Every time he blessed me, he was drawing out my voice to power the hush. "And tomorrow," Lyra said, her amber eyes turning hard and sharp as glass, "he will try to kill the music before the whole kingdom wakes up. He has called for a trial. He says I am a daughter of dissonance." The final day of the festival arrived with a sky that was no longer white, but a pale, expectant blue. The great plaza was packed with thousands of citizens, a sea of silent, expectant faces. They had heard the rumors that had rippled through the city like a fever. The king had spoken. The king had broken the glass throne. The king was no longer a statue. Malachor stood on the high dais, his violet robes shimmering with a dark, oily light. He had invoked the rite of purity, a trial designed to prove that Lyra was a witch who meant to shatter the kingdom's peace. "The girl will sing." Malachor's voice was amplified by a magical resonance, a booming, artificial sound that made Cassian's ears bleed. It was a sound without a soul, a manufactured roar. "If her soul is pure, the silence will remain. If she is a witch, her voice will be a curse upon us all, bringing back the screams of the dying." The crowd shifted, a silent, fearful wave. They had lived in the hush for so long, they were afraid of their own voices. Lyra stepped onto the dais. She looked fragile against the backdrop of the massive stone citadel, her green-stained rags fluttering in the wind. She had no bell today. She had nothing but her own lungs and a secret that Malachor had forgotten in his arrogance. Vesper, the high priest's personal guard and a powerful sound eater, circled Lyra like a shark. Vesper was a massive woman with ears that had been ritually scarred to hear only the priest's frequencies. She lunged, her hands glowing with a dark, violet energy that sucked the air and the sound out of the plaza. Lyra did not scream. She did not run. She closed her eyes and took a deep, agonizingly slow breath. And then she sang. It was not a song with words. It was a hum, a low, vibrating note that started in her feet and traveled up through her spine. At first, it was so quiet, only Cassian, tuned to her frequency, could hear it. But then, the frequency began to climb. It matched the vibration of the stone dais. It matched the frequency of the glass windows in the palace. It matched the very atoms of the silence that Malachor had spent centuries weaving. The violet energy around Vesper's hands began to flicker and pop. The woman let out a strangled cry as the sound she tried to eat became too large, too vibrant to swallow. The high priest stepped back, his face a mask of terror. "Silence her," he screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the rising tide of Lyra's resonance, and the air began to shimmer. The blue sky cracked, revealing a deep, terrifyingly beautiful gold from the setting sun. And then, the silence broke. It didn't fade. It shattered like a million crystal mirrors falling onto a marble floor. The sound was deafening, a collective roar of 400 years of trapped sound rushing back into the world. The wind screamed through the streets. The river thundered. The birds in the forest exploded into a frantic, joyous chorus. And the screams. For the first time, the people heard the screams of those trapped in the mines beneath the city. They heard the clinking of the priest's stolen gold. They heard the sound of their own hearts. They heard the truth. Malachor shriveled. Without the silence to anchor his power, the centuries of stolen life force began to drain from him in a matter of seconds. He became a husk, a small, wrinkled man in oversized velvet robes, his voice reduced to a pathetic, wet wheeze. Vesper fell to her knees, clutching her ears as the sheer volume of the world's return overwhelmed her scarred senses. She was a creature of the dark, and the light of sound was too bright. Cassian walked to the center of the dais. He didn't look at the fallen priest. He didn't look at the terrified guards. He looked at Lyra. She was pale, her voice gone, her body trembling from the effort of the weaver's song. The power had nearly hollowed her out. He caught her before she could hit the stone, pulling her into his arms, with a ferocity that made the air hum. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply held her and let his own resonance, his own heartbeat, act as her shield. He took the heavy, the sound-dampening crown from his head, a crown made of lead and cold iron, and threw it off the dais. It hit the ground with a heavy metallic clack that echoed for miles. "Oakhaven!" Cassian's voice rang out, no longer a growl, but a clear, resonant bell that reached every corner of the plaza. "The silence is over. Hear your own voices, hear the world, and hear me. You are no longer a kingdom of ghosts." The response was a sound that Cassian would remember for the rest of his life. It wasn't a cheer, it was a sob. 10,000 people, finally able to hear their own grief and their own joy, wept together. The sound of 10,000 hearts breaking and mending at once was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. 3 months later, Oakhaven was a city of noise. Children shouted in the streets, musicians played on every corner, their tunes rough and unpolished, but filled with a life that had been missing for centuries. The mines had been opened, and the wealth of the kingdom was being used to build schools where the art of resonance was taught to every child, regardless of their birth. They were learning that sound was power, but it was also a responsibility. Cassian and Lyra sat in the spire garden, which was now a riot of color, blues, reds, and yellows, so bright they seemed to hum in the afternoon heat. Cassian was reading a report from the outlying territories, his ears twitching at the sound of a distant flute playing in the marketplace below. He felt everything now. The wind on his face, the vibration of the city below, the warmth of the sun. He could hear the sap rising in the trees. He could hear the stars beginning to hum as the sun set. Lyra leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. Her voice had returned, richer and deeper than before. She held a small piece of paper, a letter from the Echo District. The people had sent a petition to name the new music hall after her. "They want to call it the Lyra Resonance," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "They say it's a tribute to the woman who gave them back their voices." Cassian smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and stayed there, crinkling the corners of his skin. He pulled her closer, his hand finding hers. The resonance between them was a constant, steady song, a faded frequency that made the rest of the world's noise fall into a perfect, beautiful arrangement. "Let them," Cassian said. "But to me, you will always be the girl who brought a cracked bell to a king who had forgotten how to listen. You didn't just give them their voices, Lyra. You gave me my soul." He leaned down and kissed her, and in the silence between their breaths, a silence that was no longer a curse, but a choice, he heard the most beautiful sound of all. The quiet, steady rhythm of two hearts finally beating in time. The winter of the great silence was gone, and in its place was a spring that would never stop singing. The kingdom lived on, no longer in shadows, but in a world where every whisper mattered and every song was a prayer. The obsidian citadel was renamed the Spire of Echoes, and the king who had been silent for 400 years became the most famous orator in history. For he knew better than anyone the value of a single, well-placed word, and beside him, the weaver of resonance watched the world she had awakened, her amber eyes bright with the music of 1,000 futures. The world was loud, and it was chaotic, and it was often discordant. But as Cassian held Lyra's hand, he knew that as long as they had each other, the music would never truly end. The high priest Malachor was never heard from again, though some say he still wanders the deep mines, searching for a silence that no longer exists. Vesper, strangely enough, became a teacher at the School of Resonance, using her unique hearing to help children find their own internal rhythms. The world had changed, and it had changed for the better. As the sun finally set over the mountains, casting long, golden shadows across the valley, Cassian closed his eyes and just listened. He heard the rustle of the leaves, the distant laughter of a child, the soft intake of Lyra's breath. He heard the world, and for the first time in 4 centuries, he was finally home. The bread of the soul was music, and the water was truth, and Cassian Thornvein had finally found a feast that would last him for the rest of his days. The crack in the bell hadn't been a flaw. It had been the doorway. And through that doorway, a kingdom had found its way back to the light. The story of the Silent King and the Weaver was told for generations. A reminder that the loudest power in the world isn't the roar of a crown, but the simple, honest chime of a heart that refuses to be silenced. Every year, on the Day of Resonance, the people of Oakhaven no longer bring gold or jewels. They bring bells. Thousands of them of all shapes and sizes, and at sunset, they ring them all at once. The sound can be heard for hundreds of miles, a glorious and a beautiful noise that tells the stars that Oakhaven is awake and it is listening. And in the high spire, the king and his queen ring a small, tarnished brass bell with a jagged crack down the side. It is the most important sound in the kingdom. It is the sound of the beginning. It is the sound of hope. And in the vibrant, noisy world they created together, that was more than enough. Cassian looked out over his people, the gold in his eyes reflecting the lanterns being lit in the streets. He felt the vibration of their joy in his feet, heard the harmony of their lives in his ears. He turned to Lyra, the woman who had seen through the lead of his heart to the starving man beneath. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Lyra smiled, her amber eyes glowing in the twilight. "I hear everything, Cassian." "Good," he said, pulling her into a dance as a distant fiddle began to play. "Because I never want to miss a single note again." The dance continued long into the night, a silent king no more, leading a kingdom that had finally found its voice. The stars hummed above them, the river sang below them, and in the heart of the citadel, 2 souls resonated in a frequency that would echo forever. The silence was gone. The music had begun, and it was, quite simply, perfect. As the final notes of the festival echoed into the night air, the people of Oakhaven went to their beds, their ears full of the sounds of a living world. The king and queen remained on the balcony, watching the moon rise over the pines. The world was a symphony, and they were the conductors, ensuring that no voice was ever suppressed again. The silence was a memory, a dark dream from which they had all finally woken up. And in the morning, the sun would rise on a world that was loud, vibrant, and utterly, beautifully alive. Cassian took a final breath of the night air, hearing the owls call and the crickets chirp. He looked at Lyra, and in the quiet resonance of their shared gaze, he knew that the greatest music was yet to come. The story of Oakhaven had only just begun. The echoes of the past were fading, replaced by the vibrant, pulsing song of the present. And as the King of Echoes finally closed his eyes to sleep, he did so with the sound of his mate's heartbeat as his lullaby, the only sound he would ever truly need.